What is happening in Canada? Why is it important to watch the breakdown of this seemingly untouchable model? What are the implications of the independence insurgency of these four Canadian provinces? How might this paradigm shift affect the West? Welcome to GeoLingo.Breakpoint. In this episode, we will unearth the secrets behind the Chinese-British power and how this joint power manages global Western politics. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew. Is there a hidden agenda behind the fight against fossil fuels in Canada? Canada has one of the world's most extensive energy infrastructures for the extraction and commercialization of fossil fuels. However, provinces like Alberta, which lead in natural gas production, have seen their projections for growth and progress sabotaged by decades of obstruction from the federal government itself. It all began with the political transformations experienced by Canada and more than 190 countries. What was Canadian energy development like before 2015? The history of fossil fuels in Canada can be divided into a before and after the year 2015. Before that year, the complex network of pipelines that interconnect Canada and transport both oil and gas were built, fundamentally by private entities. Private initiative was precisely the engine of Canadian energy development. However, after that year, everything changed. Decades of investment and specialized technical knowledge were forgotten. The private sector never again built oil or gas pipelines, despite the enormous reserves under Canadian soil. What transformed Canadian energy policy in 2015? In 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed, a historic pact in which almost every country in the world committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and gradually transforming their energy matrix. Canada, as one of the signatory countries, has taken on ambitious goals that challenge the viability of its own fossil fuel-based projects. Apparently, this blockage does not withstand the slightest macroeconomic or geopolitical analysis. The question is, why not exploit a natural resource that exists in abundance? The Paris Agreement set the path for many of the signatory countries. It all began with the sustained restriction on the use of fossil fuels for the manufacturing and automotive industries, to then promote a transition toward clean energies. In practice, this meant a systematic restriction on any project involving the financing, production, and commercialization of fossil fuels from 2016 onward. Simultaneously, there was a push for the implementation of policies based on clean energy from solar panels, wind energy, electric vehicles, etc. All of this points to the idea that the real goal is to cancel Western industry, destroy its economies, and favor the Chinese industry, a leader in the manufacturing and distribution of clean energy. About 90% of solar panels are manufactured and distributed by 4 Chinese companies. The consequences of this energy transformation, driven by Western government elites and especially by the global financial center in England called the City of London, were immediately felt. Investments in fossil fuels began to slow down, and major oil companies started to rethink their plans in Alberta, one of the regions most economically dependent on crude oil and gas. What is the historical pattern of the financial alliance that favors the enemies? To understand the logic behind this apparent economic self-destruction of the West, we must turn to the work of the British-American economist and historian Anthony Sutton. His research documented how Western financial elites, far from being bitter enemies of communism, fueled the Soviet Union and even the Nazi regime for decades with capital, technology, and knowledge. Sutton was a fierce critic of corporate capitalism because he saw it as a mechanism willing to support any foreign power if it guaranteed business and influence. Although Sutton did not focus on China, the pattern is identical. The West turned a blind eye while transferring investments, technology, and even strategic knowledge to Beijing, allowing the Communist Party to build its economic and industrial might. The same thing happened with the creation and promotion of Russian communism. Behind the rhetoric of confrontation, there was always a silent flow of collaboration that built up those who were supposedly the great enemies. In his book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, published in 1974, Anthony Sutton leaves no room for doubt. He stated, "International bankers were, in fact, interested in securing the success of the Bolsheviks. And in another of his works, he detailed how this transfer of technology and financing continued even when the official discourse was one of confrontation. The supposed opposition of Wall Street and big business to the Soviet Union was a farce. While publicly denouncing communism, they silently transferred the technology and machinery to build the industrial base of the Soviet regime, reaping enormous profits in return. Sutton documented that the Guarantee Trust Company, linked to J.P. Morgan, channeled funds to the nascent regime, while William Boyce Thompson, a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, handed over $1 million in gold to support the Soviets. His conclusion was devastating. Big capital did not see Bolshevism as a threat, but as a tool to consolidate controlled markets and destroy independent competitors. And that same logic, decades later, is what we find in the relationship with China. After the Cold War, the West turned a blind eye while channeling massive investments, technological transfers, and industrial knowledge to Beijing. The same pattern of collusion, building up a supposed enemy to, in reality, integrated into a global economic system controlled from the top. How does the City of London connect with Beijing? The assertion that there is an alliance between China and London's financial elites to bring about the overthrow of the West and move the core of world political and economic power to Beijing sounds bold, but it is precisely one of Steve Bannon's theses. Steve Bannon, a former investment banker at Goldman Sachs and a key political strategist during the Donald Trump administration, presents himself as a strong defender of American capitalism and is known for his nationalist stances. His career in the highest financial and political circles of the U.S. gives him a privileged perspective on the workings of global power. This thesis connects directly with the historical warnings of Anthony Sutton. Steve Bannon puts it bluntly. It's not that China is defeating the West on its own, it's that the West, or rather, its elites, have decided to hand power over to China. His central thesis, provocative but difficult to refute, is that China is not a rival that grew on its own but a Frankenstein created by the West. Unlike a simple politician, Bannon's career as a banker and Hollywood producer places him at the heart of two worlds, global finance and the cultural industry. From there, he saw clearly the symbiosis between Wall Street and Beijing. In multiple interviews, Bannon expressed it without mincing words. The Chinese Communist Party would not exist without the financial and business elites of the West. Wall Street finances them, Silicon Valley gives them the technology, and multinational corporations benefit from their cheap labor. It's an unholy, but tremendously effective, alliance. What are the mechanisms that sustain this alliance? The relationship between the London financial elite and the Chinese Communist Party is a carefully designed framework. Debt as a tool of power, London channels its expertise in financing toward Chinese projects, such as the New Silk Road. When countries cannot pay this debt becomes political control, allowing for the ceding of ports or strategic resources. The banking and monetary mechanism. The City of London was the first financial center in the West that allowed the free negotiation of the yuan in its markets. This gesture, far from being innocent, was a strategic move to position the Chinese currency as an instrument of hegemony. Regulatory arbitrage. London has specialized in creating opaque financial structures that allow Chinese capital to flow into the West disguised, facilitating the acquisition of strategic assets in Europe and America without arousing suspicion. Political and media cover. Think tanks, universities, and global consultancies produce narratives that normalize the idea of interdependence with China. This discourse penetrates parliaments, foreign ministries, and media outlets, silencing excesses like human rights violations. In short, the City of London provides the financial engineering, the Chinese Communist Party provides the geopolitical ambition, and together they erode the foundations of Western power. How is this global pattern reflected in Europe's loss of sovereignty? The pattern observed in Canada is repeated in Europe, and it is necessary to point out how the narratives are imposed. It is not just about climate change agreements and green pacts, but also about the restriction of freedom of expression, the systematic imprisonment of those who express disruptive ideas, and the political isolation of parties with large majorities of voters. Green pacts and environmental policies that restrict fossil fuels. Technological dependence on China in the manufacturing of clean energies. Political and economic infiltration that influences strategic decisions. This has led to partial deindustrialization on the continent, a loss of energy autonomy, and a growing dependence on Chinese products. Why is Alberta's strategy of rebellion so important? Faced with these restrictions, and after decades of turning a deaf ear to the needs of the province of Alberta, provincial authorities have adopted a strategic rebellious stance. The province now seeks to ensure that its fossil resources are exploited and commercialized, preventing the federal bureaucracy from continuing to limit its economic development. This includes avoiding bank financing and, instead, securing commercial agreements with private entities. Strategic projects like pipelines to the coasts of British Columbia, to export to Asia and seek an opening to international markets. Arguments of economic urgency. Oil and gas production is high, and the province cannot afford more delays. This stance creates tensions with Ottawa and could trigger lawsuits, but Alberta prioritizes economic development and the exploitation of its resources. It is a clear example of the struggle between local economic development and the environmentalist narrative. What does the Trump administration represent for Western rebirth? The Trump administration represents an opportunity for Western recovery, strengthening energy, industrial, and political autonomy. This contrasts with decades of facilitation by Republican and Democratic elites who favored China's manufacturing growth. Recovery strategies: internal development, reduction of dependence on critical imports, and reinvestment in own energy infrastructure. Cases of financial blocking and ideological control, such as the denial of bank accounts to opponents, show the intersection between internal politics and global geopolitics. What is the conclusion and the strategic vision behind these events? In summary, this episode shows how the conflict between local economic development and the environmentalist narrative is a symptom of a deeper pattern: Chinese influence in Western strategic decisions, facilitated by liberal governments and international financial systems. It is a historical pattern documented by Anthony Sutton and a contemporary denunciation by Steve Bannon. The Trump administration represents an opportunity for Western recovery, strengthening energy, industrial, and political autonomy. The big question remains open: does the West have the capacity and the will to cut this umbilical cord with Beijing? Because while leaders talk about democracy and human rights, capital flows tell another story, that of a progressive, silent submission disguised as pragmatism. Ultimately, if it is not recognized that the enemy is not only outside, but inside, among the elites who have benefited from this pact, the outcome will be a slow surrender.